A neighbour of mine, a careful and experienced gardener in nearly every other way, called me out to her yard 3 summers back, worried sick that her young peach tree was genuinely about to break clean in half that same afternoon. Every single branch was bowed nearly to the ground, loaded with more small green peaches than I could quickly count, and the whole tree looked like it was one strong wind away from losing a limb entirely. She had done everything right up to that point. Good site, good watering, careful feeding. What she had never done, because nobody had ever told her to, was walk out in late spring and pull off the great majority of that fruit while it was still small. She thought removing healthy young fruit sounded wasteful, even a little wrong, so she left every single one on the tree and let nature decide. Nature decided badly that year. 2 major limbs split clean off under the weight before the fruit ever ripened, and what she did harvest was mostly small, poorly coloured, and not worth the trouble of picking. She lost roughly 2/3 of her actual usable crop and a fair portion of the tree's own structure in the same season, all because she skipped a job that cost nothing but an afternoon and a bit of nerve. She is far from alone in that instinct. I have met plenty of careful, thoughtful growers over the years who handle every other part of tree care properly and still cannot bring themselves to pull healthy young fruit off a branch and drop it on the ground. It runs against something basic, the idea that more fruit sitting on a tree must always be a good thing. It genuinely is not, and understanding why changes how the whole rest of the season plays out. I am Hollis, and in 50 years of doing this work, thinning is the single most common job I see people either skip entirely or do so lightly it barely counts. It looks like you are throwing away food, so it feels wrong the first time you do it. Understanding why it actually protects both the crop and the tree changes that feeling fast, usually after the very first season you try it properly. Here is the mechanism worth understanding before anything else. A fruit tree sets far more fruit each spring than it can actually ripen well, or than its own branches can safely carry to harvest. This is simply how most fruiting species reproduce, setting more than needed as insurance against pests, weather, and poor pollination, thinning some of it out naturally on their own. Left uncorrected, that excess creates 2 separate problems at once. The tree spends its limited sugar and water across far more fruit than it can properly size and sweeten, leaving you with a large number of small underripe pieces instead of a smaller number of genuinely good ones. At the same time, the sheer physical weight of an unthinned crop puts real mechanical stress on young branches, exactly the kind that snapped my neighbour's peach tree in 2 places that same season. Thinning by hand simply does earlier and more precisely what the tree would eventually do on its own, through what growers call June drop, except thinning happens before all that wasted energy has already gone into fruit that was doomed to fall anyway. Number 1. The general timing window that applies across nearly every fruiting species. For most apples, pears, and stone fruits, the right window sits roughly 4 to 6 weeks after full bloom, once the natural June drop has mostly finished, and you can see which fruit the tree itself has already chosen to keep. Thinning any earlier means guessing which fruit will survive on its own regardless, and you may end up removing fruit the tree would have dropped for you anyway. Thinning much later means the tree has already spent significant energy on fruit you are about to remove, which wastes most of the actual benefit. A simple test that works across nearly every species is the size of a marble to the size of a nickel. Once the smallest fruit in a cluster has reached roughly that size, the tree has generally finished its own natural drop, and you can see clearly which fruit is worth keeping and which is crowding its neighbours. Number 2, apples and pears, which respond well to a fairly generous spacing. Leave 1 fruit per cluster, spaced roughly 6 to 8 inches apart along the branch, removing every other fruit in a tight grouping. Apple and pear clusters often set 5 or 6 small fruits from a single flower bud, and keeping more than 1 from that same cluster nearly guarantees several undersized pieces at harvest, regardless of spacing along the wider branch. Choose the largest, most centrally positioned fruit in each cluster to keep called the king fruit, since it typically has the strongest stem attachment and the best eventual size of the group. Number 3, Peaches and plums, which need closer attention and a tighter final spacing. Space remaining fruit 4 to 6 inches apart along the branch, which, for a heavily set young tree, can mean removing well over half of everything currently hanging there. Peaches in particular set an enormous number of fruit relative to what a branch can actually carry to a good size, and an unthinned peach branch is the single most common branch failure I see across the whole orchard each summer. This number feels aggressive the first time you do it, and that feeling is exactly why so many people underthin, rather than not thinning at all, pulling a token handful of fruit and calling the job done. Underthinning still leaves the tree carrying more than it can properly size, which means most of the real benefit never actually arrives, even though the work has technically been done. Number 4. Citrus and other ever-bearing types, which need a different approach entirely. Many citrus varieties naturally drop a large share of their own fruit through the season without help, and generally need little or no manual thinning on a home-sized tree. The exception is a young citrus tree carrying its first or second crop, where removing all or nearly all of the fruit in that first year or two lets the tree put its energy into root and branch growth instead, which pays off with a stronger, more productive tree in every year that follows. Number 5. What happens to the fruit you keep when thinning is done properly? Remaining fruit routinely finishes 20 to 40% larger than fruit left unthinned on the same tree, since it is no longer sharing the same limited pool of sugar and water with several near neighbors. Flavor and sugar content also improve measurably, since the tree is concentrating the same total resources into fewer, better developed pieces, rather than spreading them thin across everything it originally set. A properly thinned peach can finish 30% heavier than an unthinned one from the identical branch, which on a home scale is often the difference between fruit worth canning and fruit barely worth eating out of hand. Number 6. What happens to the branches themselves when thinning is skipped? An unthinned young peach or plum branch can be carrying 2 to 3 times the weight it would carry if properly thinned, and young wood on a 2 or 3-year-old tree is often not yet strong enough to bear that load through a summer storm or a heavy wind. A single split limb on a young tree can set its overall structure back several years, since the tree then has to regrow and retrain a replacement leader from scratch. For a heavily set branch you choose not to thin as aggressively. A simple wooden prop or a length of soft rope, tied loosely from the branch up to a higher, sturdier limb, can carry some of that weight through to harvest, though thinning properly in the first place is always the cheaper and more reliable fix. Number 7. The biennial bearing trap that unthinned trees fall into repeatedly. A tree allowed to carry a full unthinned crop one year often exhausts itself badly enough that it sets very little fruit the following year, alternating between a heavy year and a nearly empty one indefinitely. This pattern, called biennial bearing, is especially common in apples and can persist for the rest of that tree's productive life once it becomes established. Thinning breaks this cycle by keeping the tree's yearly energy spend roughly consistent, which tends to produce a moderate, genuinely reliable crop every single season, instead of a boom and bust pattern that never quite settles, sometimes for a decade or more once it takes hold. Number 8. The tool question, since it matters more than people expect. Thinning by hand, simply twisting or snapping small fruit off at the stem, works fine on most home-sized trees and costs nothing beyond the time itself. For a heavier set, small sharp scissors or snips reduce the risk of tearing the stem of the fruit you are keeping, which can otherwise create a small opening that invites rot later in the season. Cutting rather than pulling matters most on stone fruits, where the stem attaches close to several neighboring fruits, and a firm tug can dislodge more than intended, undoing some of the careful spacing you just worked out. In numbers, a household actually feels my neighbor's 2/3 crop loss that season on a tree that would otherwise have produced roughly 80 pounds of good fruit, worked out to something close to 50 pounds of peaches, simply never ripening into anything worth picking. On top of that came real repair time spent supporting and reshaping the damaged limbs the following spring, work that a single afternoon of thinning would have avoided entirely. Here is what you can actually do this week if your trees have already finished their bloom and set fruit. Walk your trees now and look specifically at clusters, groups of 3, 4 or more small fruits, bunched tightly together, along the same short section of branch. These clusters are where the most aggressive thinning needs to happen first, since they represent the tightest competition for the same limited resources. Start with your youngest trees first, if you are pressed for time, since young wood is the most vulnerable to breakage and the most in need of the structural benefit thinning provides, even more than the fruit quality benefit on an older, sturdier tree. Do not try to count and measure every single spacing perfectly on your first attempt. A rough-by-eye job, removing roughly half of an obviously overloaded cluster, delivers most of the benefit even if it is not textbook precise, and precision gets easier every season you practice it. If a branch is already visibly bowed or cracking under its current load, thin that branch immediately regardless of the calendar date, since a split limb waits for nobody's schedule. A quick prop underneath a heavily loaded branch, even a forked stick cut from the same yard, buys you time to finish the rest of the tree without losing that limb while you work. Work from the ground up and from the inside of the canopy outward, since the heaviest, most crowded clusters tend to sit low and close to the trunk where sunlight was already limited before the fruit ever started competing for it. Fruit thinned from these shaded, crowded spots was rarely going to size up well regardless, since poor light alone limits how much sugar a leaf near that fruit can actually produce. Keep a rough count as you go, even just a tally, on a scrap of paper tacked to a fence post. Knowing roughly how many fruit you removed from a given tree this year, compared against how many you removed last year, tells you whether that tree's overall fruit set is climbing, which usually means it is maturing well, or whether something else in its care needs a second look. I want to be honest about something here because it is the single biggest reason people quit thinning after their first attempt. It feels wasteful the first time, standing there pulling perfectly healthy young fruit off the tree and dropping it on the ground. That feeling passes. What replaces it, usually by the very next harvest, is watching your remaining fruit come in noticeably larger, better coloured, and genuinely worth the effort on a tree that is not cracking under its own crop. Thinned fruit that falls to the ground is not wasted the way it might first appear. It composts back into the soil directly beneath the tree that produced it, returning at least some of that nutrient investment rather than losing it entirely. And a light layer cleared away from the trunk itself also removes a habitat that certain overwintering pests would otherwise use. I also want to address the question I get asked most often about this whole job, which is whether thinning ever actually reduces the total pounds of fruit you end up bringing in for the season. In my own experience across 5 decades, it almost never does. Once you weigh unthinned small fruit against thinned large fruit on an actual scale, a properly thinned tree usually comes remarkably close to the same total weight as an unthinned one, simply spread across far fewer, far better individual pieces, with none of the branch damage and none of the biennial crash the following year. If you are thinning for the first time this season and feel uncertain about how far to go, err toward removing more rather than less. I have never once heard a grower regret thinning too heavily. I have heard the opposite regret: an overloaded branch lost, or a season of undersized fruit, more times than I could ever count. Across 5 decades of this work, I have put together a complete orchard health guide covering soil testing, seasonal pruning timing, and a full thinning calendar with exact spacing for every common fruit species by name. It is linked below if you want the fuller version of everything covered here today. My neighbour thinned properly the following spring, nervous the entire time, convinced she was throwing away half her harvest before it had even started. She brought me a bag of that year's peaches at the end of summer, easily the biggest and sweetest fruit that tree had ever produced, and not one single branch had so much as cracked. She told me afterward that the hardest part was not the work itself, which took her barely an hour on that one young tree. The hardest part was standing there the first 10 minutes, watching a bucket fill with perfectly healthy green peaches, and trusting that removing them was actually the right call, rather than a mistake she would regret by August. That tree has never split a limb since, and it has carried a genuinely good, reliably sized crop every single year, rather than the boom and near-empty patterns so many unthinned trees eventually settle into. She thins it herself now without a second thought, usually in under half an hour, and she tells anyone who will listen that it was the single easiest fix she ever made to that tree's whole future. 50 years of watching people skip this exact job has taught me plainly that the fruit you remove in early summer is never the fruit you actually lose. It is the fruit you are always going to lose anyway, one way or another, either by your own hand, while it is still small and worth nothing, or later by the tree's own limbs, giving out under a weight they were never built to carry in the first place. Choose the first option this season, while the fruit is still small enough to remove for free, with nothing more than your own 2 hands, rather than waiting for the second option to eventually choose for you.